Hello, everybody. My name is Peter Godfrey, and I'm the Asia Pacific Managing Director of the Energy Institute and Regional Vice President of a company called Storegga, a UK headquartered pure play decarbonisation company that is solely focused on developing economically viable carbon reduction and removal projects. I'm also a member of BritCham Singapore's Sustainability and Energy and Utilities Business Committees, who have organised this event in association with the Carbon Trust, a UK headquartered organisation that has pioneered the decarbonisation journey for more than 20 years by assisting both businesses and governments in their missions to accelerate the move towards a decarbonised future. Today, the Carbon Trust has developed a comprehensive set of value propositions aimed at providing solutions to setting net zero pathways with a vast amount of successful global implementation experience and best practice to share. From footprinting, target setting, and developing net zero pathway strategies to policy advice and program delivery, the company's mission is to seek ever smarter ways to turn intent into impact whilst ensuring that sustainability and economic realities go hand in hand. So a very warm welcome to today's webinar focused on what you need to know to help you decarbonize your own organization. But before starting, let me ask you to do two things. Firstly, would you please log on to Mentimeter? And I believe there is a slide that will be shown with the access code right now. And also please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A box from the outset. I'll try to get back to them as the session continues. And during the second part, we'll have a lot of talk about the whole situation of building up carbon targets going forwards. So I'm sure there will be lots of questions for me to get to. Now, before we get started, and whilst you get on to Mentimeter, permit me to set some context for our conversation today. Evidence overwhelmingly suggests that companies which get their ESG propositions right, particularly with respect to clear net zero aspirations, can create more business value. By paying attention to these concerns, companies don't compromise their returns, rather they potentially add value to themselves. But even as the case for a strong decarbonisation proposition becomes more compelling, an understanding of such criteria linked to value creation is often less comprehensively understood. And that can lead to investor concerns and mistrust from all stakeholders within an organization. According to a recent comprehensive survey carried out in the UK, 52% of investors find it difficult to trust a company's actions and what they say when it comes to both the environment and society. And against this backdrop, companies walk a fine line. They must actively show themselves to be good corporate citizens while proving that any investments in sustainability truly have the potential to boost business performance in the medium to longer term. So how can businesses get this balancing act right and address those stakeholder concerns? That is the core for our topic today. And without further ado, I'd like to address and introduce our first guest from the Carbon Trust, Pranoy Chowdhury. Pranoy is a senior consultant at the Carbon Trust Singapore office. His work is focused on supporting corporates on sustainability strategies, and he's advising corporates in the Southeast Asia region with regard to that journey. This includes a systematic process of carbon footprinting across the value chain, target setting, identification and quantification of climate change related risks and opportunities, labeling and assurance, and of course, developing a climate leadership framework. Now, prior to joining the Carbon Trust, Pranoy worked in industry for around 13 years, where he was developing a variety of bespoke sustainable solutions to corporate customers for their environmental sustainability needs. So Pranoy, tell me a little bit about what your past. Have you had a great time in sustainable business, or has it been a difficult journey for you as it would be for other organizations?
Yeah, first of all, Peter, thank you very much for the introducing Carbon Trust as well as my background. And on your question, yes, I mean, the sustainability topic is pretty new, I'll say. In the recent past 2 to 3 years, the focus has shifted a lot. I mean, earlier people were talking about sustainability, but there was not that much, I'll say, the action which were done by the corporates. And I have witnessed the brown to green journey of the power industry. Earlier, we have seen the power industry was heavily reliant on fossil fuels, even coal in some countries, even currently, coal is one of the major fuel sources in some of the power plants in the Southeast Asia. But I've seen that transition from coal to fossil fuel and now to solar and wind energy as well.
Interesting. So let's talk about organizations.
Yep.
Why recently has there been so much urgency on the need to decarbonize? And how has that actually translated into actions as far as organizations and your clients are concerned today? And how do you see that developing in this part of the world?
Exactly. I mean, you're absolutely right, Peter. There is a real urgency for all of us, not just at the corporate level, even at the individual level, even at the government level. And the reason being, there was a recent IPCC report, IPCC, which is basically Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change. In their latest report, they declared a code red for humanity. And the reason for that is there has been unprecedented level of increase in the GHG levels in our atmosphere, which is actually leading to global warming. And our Earth is actually already around 1.07 degrees warmer as compared to the pre-industrial level. And what does that translate to? I mean, to a layman, 1 degree is nothing much. He can just maybe turn down his aircon, and he will feel comfortable. But that 1 degree centigrade has a lot of impact on us. I mean, I'm sure all of us might have witnessed or even experienced certain extreme climate weather events, like, for example, flash floods here in Singapore in Orchard. There are so many news on that. Even I personally have experienced flash floods here in Singapore. Then prolonged drought period. I mean, there is no, weather pattern used to be quite repetitive, but now there is irregular weather patterns. There are tropical cyclones, there are forest fire, and all these are because of the increase in the global temperature level. I mean, these events, which I call it like catastrophic events or extreme weather events, it used to happen in the past as well, but now because of the increased level of GHG in our atmosphere, the frequency of happening these events have increased. I mean, we can see there are a lot of research that has been done. We have seen greater ice sheet which have melted, and because of global temperature rise, the thermal expansion of the seas are there, because of which the sea level is rising. And as you can see in Singapore, they have already started building a seawall to prevent, the seawater from kind of intruding into the kind of the main land, and avoid any physical risk to the infrastructure that can happen. So I mean, climate, yeah.
Let's pose our first question and let's get the audience involved. And people are still joining, but I don't know, Catherine, if you want to just buzz up very quickly your slide of Mentimeter again, because a number of people have joined since the last piece, or you can see it at the top of this question if you haven't yet signed in, www.menti.com with a code. But let's ask the audience, how many of you have actually witnessed an extreme weather event over the recent past? It'd be interesting to see what comments the audience have to say about that, because I think most of us have actually experienced an extreme climate event in the last year or two, one way or the other. Certainly people in the UK have. So, it's really as serious and as immediate as you make it out to be, Pranay. So that really comes on to the second question and say, okay, look, we're all in the business of doing something or trying to find ways of mitigating climate change. What are the mitigation adaptation strategies that corporates are right now adopting in terms of climate change? And how does that play into sort of the mitigation adaptation balance?
Again, Peter, I mean, as you have rightly pointed out, there are two main strategies how, the climate change can be tackled. One is on the mitigation part, another one is adaptation part. So mitigation part basically means we have to reduce our GHG emissions. And if we need to, prevent all those catastrophic events, we need to reduce it at an unprecedented rate. And as per the climate science, we need to reduce it by around 4.2% year on year. But that is sometimes not even possible. So, going forward, we have to actually start living in a warmer world. We have to adapt ourselves into living into a world which is maybe around well below 2 degrees centigrade warmer. And that is where the adaptation strategies come in. And as I mentioned earlier, like sea level will be rising, but we need to find out ways, we need to find out technological solutions, how to actually adapt ourselves to prevent, any negative impacts of those changes. So sea level rise is one of them, and building the seawall is one. Another, as I was mentioning, the flash floods. So in Singapore, government is actually, the PUB, Public Utility Board, they're actually changing or increasing the rainwater drain channel sizes, because these events used to be, once in 50 year kind of event, but now it is happening every year. So infrastructural changes are required to make kind of adaptation to this. Apart from that, from corporate point of view, they need to look at something like what are the risks and the opportunities that the climate change is bringing to their organization and to their business model. Like, for example, if a business is heavily dependent on some type of resorts, which are located in the coastal areas or on the beach areas, if the sea level rises, they will be impacted. So that is like we call it like a physical risk to the businesses. Then we have something called transition risk as well. The transition risk means, like, for example, in Singapore context, it is the carbon tax. We all know, like, Singapore government already has plan of increasing carbon tax from $5 per ton to $50 to $85 per ton by 2030. So that is also a transition risk which the corporates will be exposed to in future. Apart from that, some of the risk are technology risk. Like, for example, if a company is heavily dependent on internal combustion engines for like deliveries and the transportation, now with the new technologies, like, for example, electric vehicles coming in, that is a risk, technology risk to that organization. So they really need to adapt, and going forward, they need to have those internal combustion engines changed to the electric vehicles as well. So these are just few examples. There is a long list of risks which are exposed to, and it's not just about risk, it's also about the opportunities that the climate change is bringing on. So if the organizations can have a new business model, new products which are actually helping others to decarbonize, so corporates can capitalize on the opportunities that the climate change is bringing in as well.
So Pranoy, this session has been primarily arranged, for an SME type audience here in Singapore, and addressing this issue very much from a localized perspective. And I guess back to the Mentimeter questions. Again, for our audience, if we come back, Hasim, to question number 2, Pearl question number 2, we want to pose the question of where organizations are on their decarbonisation journey from early stage to advanced. And obviously different things need to happen at this, different points in time. As people, as our audience begins to think about that from their own perspective, Pranay, where do you see it from a sort of carbon trust perspective, both here in Singapore and across the region? Where do you feel that certainly the SME audience is in terms of that decarbonisation journey, and how do you see that sort of evolution, that story progressing over, let's say, the next 6 months, 1 year, 1.5 years, etc.?
Excellent question, Peter. SMEs who are in the western part of the world, mainly UK and US, I'll say they are pretty advanced in their sustainability journey. And the reason being, they're already feeling the pressure from the big corporates. Basically, all the SMEs will be in the supply chain of the big corporates. So the big corporates are already putting pressure in the supply chain or the SMEs to become more sustainable, how they are reducing their carbon footprints. And we have seen for the SMEs in Europe and in US, they're already quite advanced. They have done their scope 1 and scope 2 footprinting, as well as their scope 3 footprinting. And they have already set some targets, science-based target as well, and even net zero targets as well. And recently, if we talk about the SMEs, yes, they are kind of a smaller sector, but they contribute significantly to the GHG emissions as well. And if we look at the requirements from science-based targets as well, there are specific requirements which is catering to the needs of SMEs as well. And how SMEs are defined are any organization with less than 500 employed persons in that organization. But if we talk about Singapore and the Southeast Asia, I'll say they're in an early stage. I'll say they are probably calculating their scope 1 and scope 2 calculations. They are still not very clear about like where to get the data from, what are the emission factors to be used. And we at Carbon Trust have developed an online tool which can be used by SMEs, but that is more for UK SMEs. But we are planning to develop a similar tool for Singapore and Southeast Asia SMEs. So where they can just upload the data, the electricity bill, and that will automatically calculate their carbon footprints as well. But
let's take the Mentimeter slide back off again. Obviously, not many people are joining us on Mentimeter. People are actually still joining the event at this stage, so we have a lot of late arrivals. So let's leave that. But let's go back to the question of that early stage. I mean, the general view here is that with an SME hat on, that the vast majority of SMEs is still at an early stage. Is that what you're saying, Prannoy?
Exactly. I mean, pretty much. I mean, most of the SMEs are at very early stage because currently I'll show you, like, I mean, there are different kind of, like there can be top-down approach as well. Like Singapore government can make it mandatory for all the SMEs to actually report their GHG emissions. But currently government hasn't done that. Government currently only requires the facilities which are actually kind of have to submit their carbon tax. They need to submit their GHG report on an annual basis. But probably in future, maybe 2 to 3 years time, you might see government asking all the SMEs in Singapore to actually submit their GHG reports as well. And that will actually be a very good first step in the sustainability journey.
So within that context, obviously we talk about carbon footprints and starting off with at least an initial carbon footprint for the company. A lot of people are immediately put off and said, oh, that's going to be a lot of administration work. We can't do it. It's too much. Try and give your sales spiel as to why it's not actually that complicated a process. Why don't you talk us through how those carbon footprints can be developed and relatively simply and relatively cost effectively in order to, at least to get the ball rolling on this whole thing.
Exactly. So Peter, like I'm a consultant, my everyday job is to actually advise the clients on footprinting and all. But usually my advice to clients will be scope 1 and scope 2 footprinting, especially for SMEs, is relatively quite simpler and quite easy to do. And later in the session today, I think Hazem will be covering a lot more details. And I believe at the end of the sessions, the attendees will feel much more confident how they themselves can actually calculate their scope 1 and scope 2. And just to Peter answer that question, maybe I can quickly say what scope 2 refers to. Scope 2 actually in Singapore context, it is just the electricity that you're purchasing, and that you can easily find out basically your kilowatt hours from your electricity bill. I mean, that number will be sitting somewhere in some procurement department or finance department somewhere who is tracking that electricity consumption. So you just need to take that number, multiply it with the grid emission factor. I mean, there are a lot of complexities as well. If you're buying from a particular retailer, then the market-based approach comes in as well. And that's where probably we can come in and advise the SMEs as well how to do that calculation. But at a very, very simple level, just get your kilowatt hour number, multiply by the grid emission factor, and you'll get your scope 2 emissions. Similarly, for scope 1, if you have any processes which are burning fuels, or if you have any fleet vehicles, which is burning any petrol or diesel, hopefully no diesel in Singapore. But if you're burning that, keep a track of that and multiply by the emission factor for that specific fuel, and you will get your scope 1 emissions as well. I mean, I have made it very, very simple, but this is a very good start. And where we as a consultant can come in is once the organization has already done their best in calculating scope 1 and 2, we can come in and do a verification for them, like an ISO standard verification, and where we can find out basically the gaps in their calculations. Yeah, Peter.
So let me carry on with my yes buts. I agree with you. Everybody can do this, but looking behind me, at the route to net zero standard, there's a lot of confusion around all of these definitions: science-based targets, net zero, carbon neutral, route to net zero, et cetera, et cetera. Now, how this is quite confusing for most people in terms of saying, well, we can do this, but does it really fix what we need to fix? is this going to be sustainable? Is what we do at the outset actually going to work in 1 month or 6 months or a year's time when the regulators come in and tell us to do something completely different? So how is this all being organized in terms of getting a standard and getting a way of doing this that is simple, straightforward, analytical, easy to do from an administrative point of view?
I totally agree with you, Peter. There's so many terms out there in the market like net zero, carbon positive, carbon neutral, zero carbon, carbon zero. And there is a concern with those because these can lead to something called greenwashing as well. And sometimes, the clients, they don't even know that they are greenwashing. Their intent is not to do a greenwashing, but just, just because they don't know what the terms mean, they use those terms just randomly. And then they are, kind of exposing themselves to the greenwashing accusations. So maybe what I'll do is share a few of the terms, what exactly they mean, and probably SMEs should be using those terms in their communication to their stakeholders as well. So the very first term that most of us will be hearing is science-based target. So what is a science-based target? A science-based target basically means when an organization is setting a target, they have to reduce their emission by a certain percentage, and that reduction is based on the climate science. Basically, what the science is, in order to keep our temperature rise below 1.5 degrees centigrade, how much they need to reduce. So, an organization can say, I can only reduce 1%, I can only reduce 2%, but it's not about how much you can reduce, it's about how much you have to reduce as per the science. So please use the science-based target kind of definitions on how much you need to reduce. And in that science-based target, there are two types of targets. One is called a short-term target, which is like in next 5 to 10 years, how much you need to reduce. Then there is something called a long-term target, and which actually culminates into the net zero target. And that has to be achieved by all of us by 2050. And what does that mean? Achieving a net zero state for a corporate means latest by 2050, you need to reduce your 90 to 95% of your emission. It's an actual reduction of your emissions as compared to the baseline levels in 2021 or 2022. And the rest, 5 to 10% of the emissions, you can actually neutralize it using a specific type of carbon offsets, which is called greenhouse gas removals. Basically, the offsets which are removing the CO2 from the atmosphere. And those can come from projects like for afforestation, which is like planting new trees, or removing carbon from the atmosphere, which is called direct air carbon capture. So these are all the engineering technology which are coming up. But currently the price of these kind of offsets is very, very high. Hopefully by around 2040, the prices will become much affordable, I'll say. But if you go to the market now, you'll find so many carbon offsets which are avoided deforestation, avoided emission type of offsets. And those are not, I'll say, permitted in order to claim your journey towards net zero. Those you can use in carbon neutrality claims. That's the third terminology. So carbon neutrality basically means, and any organization can be carbon neutral, maybe next month or next year. What you need to do is you just need to footprint how much scope 1 and scope 2 and probably scope 3 your footprints are. And you can just buy equivalent amount of carbon offsets, which can be avoided deforestation type of offset, which are easily available. Once you buy that using past 2060 standard, you can actually kind of claim that your organization for scope 1 and scope 2, you're carbon neutral. And carbon neutrality can be at the product level as well. So yeah, these are the differences. So please don't confuse between net zero and carbon neutrality. They are very different things and they achieve very different purposes as well.
The only thing I'm going to disagree with you, and you won't be surprised being a representative of Storegga, carbon capture and storage is going to be much more economic a lot sooner than you think, Pranoy. I assure you.
I'll be the most happy person, Peter. We are actually looking forward to those kind of technology advancement, and hopefully, if we can have carbon removals scaled up within the next 5 to 10 years, that would be a very, very good sign. Because ultimately, it's about keeping our temperature rise below 1.5 degrees centigrade. Yeah, that's the whole objective, our common objective, I'll say. Yeah.
Agreed. So look, enough discussion. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Hassim. So Hassim, if you'd like to come onto screen. Hassim Rosli is an associate for Southeast Asia, based here in Singapore for the Carbon Trust. He supports the delivery of the the UK government's ASEAN low carbon energy program here in the region. And prior to joining Carbon Trust, Hasim spent approximately a year in Bangkok, where he consulted for the UNFCCC and the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies on climate finance, green financial inclusion, and regional carbon markets. So I'm sure, Hasim, you're going to have some views on, as with regard to the discussion that we've just had now about where all of this is going to play out going forwards. So Hasim holds a master's in environmental policy from Po Paris School of International Affairs, and is a chemical engineer originally from NUS, so Singaporean, studied with NUS. Very good to have you here, Hasim. You're going to walk us through a little bit more in terms of the mechanics. So over to you, sir, for your presentation. And meanwhile, once again, may I request those that are listening to please fill in Q&A, because there'll be a lot of opportunity for me to pose some questions to Hasim as he talks through his session. Over to you, Hasim. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Peter. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for making the time to attend this webinar on what you need to know to decarbonize your organization. My name is Hasim Rosli, and I'm an associate at the Carbon Trust. So just briefly running through the agenda for this session, I will have a brief introduction on the topic of greenhouse gas emissions, greenhouse gas emissions accounting, and climate change. After which, I will run through an overview of how to go about accounting for your greenhouse gas emissions, and then also running through the mechanics underlying the calculation that you need to do to get to the bottom of your organizational carbon footprint. And we'll also then run through a couple of decarbonization actions that your company can choose to do, and then how all of these actions should be put together into a roadmap for your organization to get towards net zero. In terms of the running of today's session, there will be questions that will be posed on Mentimeter. So if you have only just joined, please scan the QR code here, or go to www.menti.com and use this 8-digit code that you see at the bottom. And we will, at some points, we will post some questions, so please feel free to respond to them when you see it on the screen. And at the same time, please also feel free to just drop in your questions in the Q&A box of the Zoom platform. We'll address them as we go through the webinar. So just to really quickly introduce the Carbon Trust again. So we are a low carbon sustainability consultancy, and our mission is to accelerate the move to a decarbonized future. We are present across 5 continents, headquartered in the UK. We have presence in Singapore, of course, Beijing, South Africa, Brazil, Washington, DC, and also Mexico City. We have grown to more than 300. We are now more than 300 consultants, and we have more than 20 years of experience in sustainability consultancy. We've been in this field for a very, very long time, I would say. Yeah. And in terms of corporate advisory is one of our core service offerings, and we provide expert insight that helps leading companies make business sense of climate change and how they can then build successful strategies, sustainability strategies that deliver material impacts and create long-term value for them. So the Carbon Trust, we've worked with, we are experts in footprinting, and we have worked with companies across a wide range of sectors. We have developed the world's first carbon footprinting standard, and have also led and also was the lead contributor to all 3 product footprinting standards. We also co-authored the technical guidance to the greenhouse gas protocols, Scope 3 emissions footprinting, and we've worked with over 500 organizations from varied sectors and with varied objectives. And we have advised other schemes worldwide as well, and we have also used footprinting as the basis for target setting, reductions, redesign, etc. So here you can see a range of clients that we have worked with. We've basically worked with clients from the retail and FMCG sector to healthcare, to industrials, to financial services, hospitality and leisure, and food and drink. So we've basically worked with a whole list of clients globally and across all industrial sectors. So going into the topic of greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. So we see on the graph, the graph here on the right. This shows you the CO2 emissions by source, and over the time from the period of 1751 to 2013. So we see that the greenhouse gas emissions have increased quite substantially and almost exponentially over the past 100 years or so. And over half of the cumulative CO2 emissions have occurred in the last 40 years, actually. So we see that industrialization has led to a rapid increase in greenhouse gas emissions, and many of them come from solid fuel, the combustion of solid fuel, from liquid, and also from gases. So in terms of breakdown by sector, we see that greenhouse gas emissions occur throughout almost all sectors. We see them happening in the industry sector, in the building sector, in the transport sector, in the waste sector, and also in the agriculture, forestry, and land use sectors as well. It happens everywhere. It's something that happens in a lot of sectors. So it's quite important for all organizations to be involved in efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, you need to measure them in order so that you can manage your greenhouse gas emissions. So we see that to help the world decarbonize is multi-tiered, also because greenhouse gas emissions occurs through all sectors. So every sector has to be involved, and the easiest way to go about reducing your greenhouse gas emissions is to transition from consumption of fossil-based electricity to renewable-based electricity sources. But there are also other measures that can be done that can be implemented, and we'll run through them in a bit more detail later as well. So just to start things off, for organizations, it's quite important for organizations to have a sense of how much their operations and activities are contributing to the global greenhouse gas emissions. So to do this, what you have to do is you would have to undertake a carbon footprinting exercise. And this helps to measure the total greenhouse gas emissions caused directly and indirectly by a person, organization, or product. So there are various kinds of footprinting. So it is measured in tons or kilograms of CO2 equivalent, and which combines the impact of different greenhouse gases into one figure, equivalent to if it were all carbon dioxide. And this is based on their global warming potential values. Excuse me. So carbon dioxide is the most common greenhouse gas. It is especially the case in energy supply. Methane and nitrous oxides are also key greenhouse gases, and they are especially key in the agriculture sector. And so a carbon footprint, organizational footprint is the emissions that arise from all activities across an organization. So it could include buildings energy use, it could be from industrial processes, from company vehicles, and they're also known as Scope 1 and 2 emissions. There is also such a thing called value chain footprint. So this looks at the emissions that arise outside an organization's own operations. So it is also known as Scope 3 emissions. And it includes emissions from suppliers and consumers, emissions relating to the use of the product, and also the end of life treatment of the product, for example. So it is essentially, you're looking at, so in value chain footprint, you're basically looking at what is the impact of everything I buy, everything I sell, what I lease, employee travel, and etc. Value chain footprinting is very it's a very comprehensive footprinting measure, and it has 15 subcategories to look at if you want to do a fully robust value chain footprinting exercise. And you can also do and conduct product footprinting. So this is where you measure the emissions associated with a product or service across its full life cycle. So for final products, this covers the whole life of the product, from the extraction of the raw materials and manufacturing right through its use and final reuse, recycling, or disposal. For interim products, so these are products which are used to create final products. The assessment starts at raw materials but concludes at the point in which the product leaves the company's control. So this gives you an idea of what is the emissions associated with the production of a product. Yeah, and for today, we will be focusing more on the organizational footprint, because that's the first step that SMEs and corporates should look at as they begin on their sustainability journey. So why do organizations focus on organizational footprinting? What are the benefits to undertaking this? So basically, there are multiple dimensions to the benefits that carbon footprinting brings to you and your stakeholders. There are some internal drivers, and these include reducing cost. By undertaking organizational footprinting exercise, you are able to identify where within your operations and activities, where your emission hotspots are, and what you can then do and then you can then set strategies to address this emission hotspot and reduce the overall amount of emissions. So this will then help you achieve energy savings, which will also most of the time lead you to achieve cost savings, which will help your organization's bottom line. You can also help to reduce waste, optimize your supply chain, and also identify areas for eco-design and assess different product options. So it also helps you to manage future risk. So it's something that Pranoy mentioned earlier in the fireside chat is that, for example, there are transition risks associated with climate change and sustainability. So for example, Singapore introduced the carbon tax back a few years ago and are now looking to raise it a lot higher. So the transition from $5 per ton to $15 per ton and subsequently even higher will then lead to future risk for companies, because that means that companies who are involved in emissions intensive processes and operations will incur higher costs, higher operating costs, which will then affect their bottom line. So this also allows you to manage your future risks and also helps you manage your future supply, cost, demand, legislation, and trends as well. There are also some external drivers. So in some countries, you are required to comply to certain legislation that require you to measure your organization's carbon footprint and to report them to the government authority. So that's also one reason why companies do them. And some of the leading companies, some of the more advanced companies in terms of their sustainability journey also undertake organizational footprint to influence, to involve customers and suppliers, investors, NGOs, and governments in recognizing their efforts on sustainability. So there are various dimensions and drivers for sustainability. So here we will move to Mentimeter. We have a question here. So for those of you who have just joined, please can I request that you go to www.menti.com and use this code 84416126. We have a question that we want to run with the audience. So how would you rank the following drivers? So these were the 4 drivers that I just gone through. How would you rank them in the order of importance for you and your organization? Hope everyone's able to access Mentimeter. Just bear with me while I reshare my screen. Oh, here we are. Yeah. Okay, so we've got a couple of responses in. So yeah, to manage future risks, it's now identified as the first most important driver. To comply as well, fair enough. Legislation, you have to comply. To reduce costs, third. To influence, fourth. Yep, compliance is increasing in terms of rank. To manage future risk. I'm just going to leave this here for another 15-20 seconds while we wait for more responses. Okay, so I think we see that we do recognize that compliance is a very important issue. It's a very important driver of companies undertaking organizational carbon footprint. Fair enough. And coming at close second is to manage future risks. I think this is something that is great. It's great to see companies looking forward and looking to see how climate change translates into affects your company's financial bottom lines. Let me just switch back to the PowerPoint slides for a bit. Okay, so we are now back to the PPT. Okay, yeah. So basically, just to introduce at a very high level and very quickly, there are basically 3 scopes to greenhouse gas emissions. There are scopes 1, 2, and 3, and this is especially important for organizational carbon footprinting. Scope 1 emissions are direct greenhouse gas emissions that occur from sources that are controlled or owned by an organization. So for example, they come from emissions associated with fuel combustion in boilers, furnaces, or through the use of transport vehicles that are owned and controlled by the company. So it's the green arrow here. Scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions associated with the purchase of electricity, steam, heating and cooling for own use. In the case of Singapore, it's mostly electricity, although there may be instances of steam purchase as well in industrial estates. And scope 3 emissions is related to your value chain footprint. So this is one that I mentioned earlier. It covers activities upstream of your operations and downstream, and there are basically 15 subcategories, which include employee commuting, business travel, transportation and distribution, waste generation in operations, and end-of-life treatment of sold products. Yeah. So how do you go about calculating your carbon footprint? So this is the overarching equation or guidance that you should that sort of guide the calculation process. So your organizational carbon footprint is basically the sum of activities that produce carbon emissions multiplied by an emissions factor. So an emissions factor is a conversion factor that accounts for the amount of emissions that is being produced per unit of activity data. So activity data refers to the kilowatt hours that you consume in the case of electricity, the liters of fuel that you consume in case of fuel consumption, or the kilometers traveled if you were to drive a company vehicle, for example. So basically, this is the overarching equation that helps you measure your organizational carbon footprint. Yeah, so now we're going to go into a bit more detail into how you can actually calculate your organizational carbon footprint and what it means for you and what organizations have to do to get to these results. So first thing to think about is what method to use. I think as Pranoy alluded to earlier, there are a couple of standards out there. There is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. There is also the ISO 14064-1. So these two standards guide are good standards to use to calculate your organizational carbon footprint. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol is the most commonly used one. You can also use the ISO 14064. It's also widely accepted. It builds upon the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, so people tend to use the Greenhouse Gas Protocol over the ISO. The second step that you have to do is you have to define the operational and organizational boundaries. So there are two different types of approaches, either an equity approach or a control approach. So an equity approach looks at reporting the equity share of emissions, whereas the control approach looks at reporting 100% share of emissions over areas where company has full control of its activities. Another thing to think about is the time period. So it has to be for a period of it has to be a consecutive 12-month period. So it can be over a calendar year, it can be over a financial year, it can also be free. Organizations are also free to define these 12 months as they see fit and as they like, as long as it's a 12-month consecutive period. And it is also important to define the emissions boundaries. So for example, there are various boundaries for your organizational carbon footprint. You can choose to include only scope 1 and 2. You can choose to include scope 1, 2, and 3. Or you can also choose to include scope 1, 2, and perhaps only the business travel subcategory of scope 3. So the latter one, which is scope 1, 2, and business travel subcategory of scope 3 is something that we see a lot of companies doing. So that is also definitely an approach that can be done in coming up with and in measuring and reporting your organizational carbon footprint. So looking at this into a bit more detail, there are basically two different kinds of control approaches. One is operational control. So this is if the company or subsidiary has full authority to introduce and implement its operating policies at the operation. So for example, if you lease an office and don't financially own it, but can change the electricity tariff you're on and upgrade lighting, so that defines operational control. And this is the approach that is most widely adopted by most organizations when they report their carbon, their organizational footprint. There is also the financial control approach, which is where the organization reports the areas in which it has direct control over financially and the operating policies of the operation. Yeah. So as mentioned earlier, I think I did say that organizational footprinting must include scopes 1 and 2 at the very least. So again, scope 1 emissions are direct greenhouse gas emissions that occur from sources that are controlled or owned by an organization. So it is, for example, there are emissions associated with fuel combustion in boilers, furnaces, and vehicles. Scope 2 emissions are indirect greenhouse gas emissions associated with the purchase of electricity, heating, cooling, and other utilities. So let's look at Scope 1 in a bit more detail. Yeah. So there are basically, Scope 1 is basically made up of 4 different types of direct emissions. You have the fuel combustion, own transport, process emissions, and fugitive emissions. So fuel combustion is, for example, maybe when you have a diesel generator or if you consume natural gas. So it is emissions arising from the combustion of fossil fuels. From owned transport, it is the emissions arising from the use of internal combustion engine transport fleet. And for process emissions, and this is especially the case for the chemical sector, it is emissions arising from the chemical transformation of raw materials. And fugitive emissions, it is especially those arising from extraction, transport, storage, and processing of fossil fuels, but can also occur in many other activities. So one example is refrigerants from air conditioners. So that is one example of fugitive emissions that organizations should look at when measuring their organizational footprint. Yeah, so Scope 2 is, as mentioned earlier, it's to include the emissions arising from the purchased electricity, heat, and steam. So the combination of Scope 1 and Scope 2 looks at, sums up your organizational footprint under your organizational control. So in terms of Scope 3 emissions, so like I mentioned earlier, there is also Scope 3 emissions which look at, which can be included within your organizational boundaries. So this is business travel, and it's something that is significant and can sometimes be accounted for as part of your organization. So it is significant, especially for organizations that are not involved in energy-intensive industrial processes. For example, consultancies have high business travel emissions. Professional services firms have high emissions arising due to business travel. So those are things that you should also look at when you're calculating your organizational carbon footprint. So once you have defined that the boundaries, you then have to collate the data. When companies and organizations start collecting the data within the boundary and look at all the relevant emission sources, it is to make it easier for organizations, it is encouraged that companies and organizations regularly look at the data and make sure that there is good data quality. So have a look and try to identify whether there are any anomalies, make sure data improvements are made where necessary. And it is really important that that companies make sure that companies have all the data sources across all the relevant sites. So what we've seen is that oftentimes when we work with companies, there are times that they don't actually have access to the data. They don't actually collect the data at this point. So it is key that companies identify what are the sources of emissions and then ensure that all these data are collected. There may also be instances and cases where you forget that there is an emission source. So for example, air conditioners and the refrigerants within them, this is part of fugitive emissions. Organizations tend to forget about this. And so it's really important that organizations remain on top of this, on top of all the emission sources and are aware of all of them. So in terms of sources of data that you require to calculate your Scope 1 and 2, so for electricity and gas consumption, so all of them, you can look at automatic meter readings that perhaps collect data at half-hourly intervals, perhaps. You can also look at invoices from suppliers or even collect data from meters manually. So perhaps you have someone who's responsible to go down and record this data and measure the actual amount that has been consumed. For fuel, this is generally invoices. So for example, if you were to purchase a certain amount of diesel, you should have records of that, and you should have invoices that you get from your diesel supplier, for example. And from your company-owned fleet, excuse me. So the best practice is to have fuel cards for each vehicle. This card can be used to pay for the fuel consumption of vehicles at your petrol stations. The card also records the amount of fuel used, which can then be used to calculate the emissions arising out of the use of the vehicle fleet. So, and it is also it can also be used to purchase fuel. It can also have purchase fuel consumption records and use them. And you can also use the expense claims that various colleagues in your organizations submit to your finance department when they purchase fuel for the vehicles. So this is less accurate, but it nonetheless gives you a sense of the amount of fuel that you've consumed, and therefore you can then estimate the amount of emissions associated with your organizational carbon footprint. Yeah, and last but not least, refrigerants. This is very important. So you should have F-gas maintenance logs, and this is where you can collect your data for refrigerants. So for scope 3, we're just covering business travel. So you could have data on fuel consumed or distance traveled. Fuel consumed is more challenging because it's quite hard to ask, for example, airlines how much fuel they use for a flight from Singapore to London, for example. So what you will do is you will then use the distance travel, and because this is the option that for which you have the most available data. It is also important to also have the mode and class of travel, for example, business economic class. And also you can also do this and estimate the amount of carbon emissions through expense claims as well. But again, this is less accurate as compared to the other methods mentioned above. So in terms of data requirements, so again, let's look back at the fuels combustion example. So the best data to have is data collected half hourly by a meter where possible. And the next best would be to have manual meter readings so that there will be actual data and then invoices from suppliers. So you could use estimated invoices if you're not submitting consumption to your suppliers, and if they're just estimating the amounts you're consuming and where there is no data available. If there is no data available, organization will have to apply some sort of data estimation methodology to ensure that it is the amount that is consumed and the emissions associated with the consumption is robust and it's reflective of the consumption that is being consumed. So in terms of, again, on the data quality hierarchy, I think just looking at what kind of estimations a company can use. So firstly, there is primary data. So this is the best type of data which to use. It directly reflects the amount of a resource consumed. So for example, the exact number of kilowatt hours of electricity consumed at the site, or the liters of fuel consumed by the vehicle fleet. So where possible, primary data should be collected and provided. The next best is estimates based on proxy data, where actual data is not available, estimates can be done, and these estimates have to ensure that they reflect the actual consumption as closely as possible. So if you have cost of fuel consumed, you can convert that to the number of miles traveled, which isn't a very accurate way of estimating, but provides a way of estimating the number of miles traveled nonetheless. So that's an example of a proxy data that you can use. And the least accurate approach is to look at the estimates based on similarities. So where no direct data is available, estimates should be used based on best available comparison. So for example, to compare consumption figures from a comparable site, or using benchmark figures, and for example, like energy consumption per square meter within a sister facility, for example. So key data collection challenges. So there are a couple of data collection challenges that we've seen from various companies, from our experience working with various companies. So we would like to hear your thoughts on what you think are these key data collection challenges. So I will now go back to Mentimeter, and I'm keen to hear what are some of your thoughts on which are the challenges that you experience in your organization. Yeah, so what are some data collection challenges your organization has faced or is facing? Is it data not collected? Are there version control errors? Is it a problem of data accuracy? Or is there poor data maintenance? Yeah, so we see a couple of responses coming in. 2 for each data not collected and poor data maintenance. So we fully concur with this as challenges. As from our experience of working with companies, we see that there are some data that there are emission sources that the companies perhaps tend to sometimes overlook, and therefore the data is not collected. And sometimes there is also poor management of data. There isn't a centralized point where data is collected and stored. So it can be quite hard to then measure what is the actual carbon emissions associated with that. Okay, I will shift back to the slide deck. Yeah. Okay, yeah. So basically there are a range of data collection challenges that you can experience. The first of which is estimated versus actual. So for example, utility bills can be estimated instead of actual consumption value. So this skews your analysis. So a lot of utility bills can be estimated if you're not submitting your meter readings. And there's also human errors. So if companies use expense systems, for example, they are relying on employees inputting the data correctly. So if the data is not being input correctly, this could obviously lead to errors. There are also things such as version control when creating these footprints and data, especially if they're not on top of the versions that are last updated. It could then lead to people updating the wrong spreadsheets, for example. Traceability is also an issue. It could be that it could be that the spreadsheets and the internal systems and tools that are used to measure the greenhouse gas, the carbon footprint, is it's hard to manage. It's a large Excel spreadsheet and people may not be familiar. So if you don't see where the data sources come from, it can be difficult for someone else to replicate that measurement approach and to understand how the calculation is being done. It is also quite key to understand the context. So sometimes if there are any large changes year on year or month on month, there's a need to be able to account for the differences. Companies should be able to explain why there are sharp spikes or decreases in emissions. I think that will also be something that the company want to look at to see if there are any problems with the processes or if there are any issues with the ongoing operations. As mentioned earlier, maintenance is also an issue. Sometimes it's important to make sure that there are no errors, formulas are updated, and you don't get errors returned in your Excel spreadsheets. You have to make sure that the emissions tracker is maintained and updated to a good quality. So these are just some of the key data collection challenges that we've seen and we've identified as with our clients, but there are a lot more out there that we know exist as well. Yeah, so the next part is on applying the emission factors. So the emission factors, as I mentioned earlier, they are basically conversion factors which associate the amount of activity to an emissions value. So in the case of electricity, that would be a grid emission factor where you get the kilograms of CO2 per kilowatt hour, for example. So you can get this emission factors from large databases such as EcoInvent or Gabi. The UK government also publishes emission factors annually. They are specific to the UK, but you can also use them internationally. And in terms of the grid emission factor, there are two kinds of emission factors that can be used. So this is for your scope 2 greenhouse gas footprinting for electricity consumption. There is a location-based emission factor. So, and this is derived based on an average emissions factor in the operating countries, grid average. And you also have a market-based emission factor. So this is based on the greenhouse gas emissions emitted by the electricity supplier. So this will be specific to the supplier itself. And if the electricity purchase is backed by renewable energy certificates or RECs, this value would then be 0. So that would mean that like your scope 2, if all your if all the electricity that you consume are from a supplier which has RECs to back them, then your scope 2 emissions could be 0. Yeah, so and the last few steps is to verify the results of your greenhouse gas emissions. You have to confirm, you have to verify, get in touch with an external third party to assure and verify the results and to ensure that the accuracy of the total footprint measured. And you can also then verify that you have taken action to reduce your emissions. And this will then help to add credibility and confidence to your your carbon reporting for public disclosure. So here we have an example of it's a law firm. When this sort of shows you how the law firm undertakes its organizational carbon footprint. So it follows an operational control approach, and it covers a 12-month calendar year from January to December 2020, and it covers all of scope 1 and 2, and also business travel and the business travel subcategory of the scope 3 emissions. So in terms of the data that it collects for scope 1, it collects invoices for for consumption of natural gas. It has F-gas maintenance logs to look at refrigerants and fuel cards for company-owned vehicles. For scope 2, there are invoices for purchased electricity, and for scope 3, it measures this through expenses paid for business travel. So on the table here, you can see the various scopes, the various sources of emissions, and the associated emissions in terms of tons of CO2 equivalent, and what that means in terms of what do you call that? In terms of the share of the organization's carbon footprint. So again, in this case, this is a law firm, so it's a professional services firm. Business travel, especially arising from air, takes up close to half of the organization's entire footprint, and with purchased electricity coming a close second. So it is sometimes very important this is why some organizations include their business travel as part of their organizational carbon footprint. So this is another case study. This is with Prime Minister. So this is a company that we've worked with in the Carbon Trust. So we work with them to measure their organizational carbon footprint, as well as some selected scope 3 categories. So basically, Prime Minister has been making award-winning pies in Bristol since 2003, and they are becoming well known for its plant-based range, as well as its responsibility for high source, high welfare classics. So it has set itself a series of challenging goals to hit by 2025, and it aims to become a sustainability leader in the sector. So the Carbon Trust supported its ambition by calculating their organizational footprint, as well as business travel, waste generated in operations, and end of life of sold product emissions in accordance to the GHG protocol. So what we did was we identified hotspots within the calculated footprint and provided recommendations for improving data quality and footprint reduction opportunities. So some key statistics from this case study. So Prime Minister plans to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 50% in 2025, with a view to being certified to the internationally recognized past 2060 carbon neutral standard by 2023. And also by 2025, Prime Minister will reduce its total waste by 30%, increasing the amount that is recycled or composed. So here you see a short quote from John Simon, the co-founder and MD of Prime Minister. Yeah, so another case study that I also want to highlight is with VF Corp. So they basically underwent an intensive 2-year-long collaborative process with the Carbon Trust to develop new science-based targets. So Pranoy mentioned science-based targets earlier. They basically set this science-based targets, so SBTs, in line with the Paris Agreement, and will cut its scope 1 and 2 emissions by more than half over the next decade, and will reduce the more challenging scope 3 emissions by 1/3 over the same period. So the Carbon Trust helped them set an absolute scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions reduction of 55% by 2030 from a 2017 base year, and scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions from the categories of purchased goods and services and upstream transportation to reduce by 30% by 2030, and from a 2017 base year as well. So what we did was primary data was gathered from VF's 1,400 owned facilities, distribution centers, and global logistics, as well as more than 100 tier 1 and 2 suppliers. So we helped them strengthen their ability to identify and implement reduction strategies. So I think this example also demonstrates that it can be quite, undertaking an organizational carbon footprint exercise can be quite extensive, especially if your company is large and has a lot of facilities and activities that it controls. So also as part of this work, we also help them develop bottom-up targets for their scope 1 and 2 and scope 3 emissions. So this predominantly looked at developing an ambitious material strategy, which will have positive impacts cascading through the industry. Yep. And now just moving on to a couple of, oops, bear with me here a bit. So what you can do in terms of decarbonizing actions. So for facilities, this could be buildings, this could be industrial sites. So it's firstly important to understand your energy use. So look at your office, look at your facility, and identify major areas of energy consumption. Check the existing condition, you know, of the various equipment, and then look at how the equipment is operating. Has it been maintained properly and according to best practice? So that's number one that you should do. From there, identify the opportunities to compile a checklist of an energy checklist to identify where energy savings can be made. So based on those opportunities, prioritize these actions. Or draw up an action plan detailing a schedule of improvements and responsibilities. And where needed, seek specialist help. So implement some energy saving measures in-house, but seek help from energy service companies, for example, for the more complex options, especially those that require integration of energy across various processors, across various equipment. I mean, it is very useful to get the help of energy savings companies. They can also then tailor the business model of that support based on the savings that you achieve through the implementation of energy efficient measures. Excuse me. So once you've implemented the efforts and the energy efficient interventions, it is useful to measure the energy savings actions against original consumption figures. This is so you know the impact of your actions, and you can. It also allows you to track your performance, which you can then report as part of your organizational carbon footprint. And of course, energy efficiency and understanding your energy use is not a do once and you're done kind of activity. It's something that you have to continually do. So where there are policies, they have to continually be enforced. So systems and procedures have to also be developed and continually maintained and used to ensure the business operates efficiently. Yeah, so organizations can identify emission hotspots to focus efforts to reduce emissions. And this could be through operating procedures or through, for example, through some of their investments, for example. So generally, organizations can benefit from electrification because you then rely on the grid, and when there are higher amounts of renewable energy contributing to the grid, the overall emissions associated with your operations will reduce. So some of the key measures that you can do is to replace your gas boilers with air source heat pumps, or to swap to electric equipment. The other thing that you can do is also to swap your refrigerants, your existing refrigerants, to ones that are of lower global warming potential. So this not only helps reduce your organizational carbon footprint, but sometimes it also helps to reduce the ozone depletion potential and helps to reduce, it helps to maintain the ozone layer. Yeah, and also the benefits of electrification can be enhanced under a market-based approach by swapping to a renewable electricity tariff, thereby reducing your Scope 2 emissions to a zero, basically. Yeah, and for your fleet of vehicles, so again, the first thing that you should do is you need to understand your fuel use, your fuel consumption. So have a look at all the vehicle fleets that you have, that you owned, and identify major areas of consumption. So again, and this is the case not only for vehicles, but for everything. Good data quality is key for reducing energy use. So once you have that understanding, then you can then move on to look at whether or not your vehicles have been regularly maintained. It is important to ensure that your vehicles are regularly maintained to ensure efficiencies are maintained and improve where they can, and to reduce the carbon impact of any faults. So review your fleet. So review the vehicles procured with an environmental agenda in place to consider low carbon impact vehicles. So for example, in some countries, there are some legislation that have been put in place. There are some targets that have been put in place that there will be no more internal combustion engines to be sold after a certain year. So those are things that you have to consider as part of your business strategies and planning as well. Also look at identifying other initiatives. Are there other considerations relating to fleet efficiencies that can be made during procurement? So you have, for example, telematics and sat-navs, for example. And again, savings should be measured. So after you implement, measure your energy savings actions against original consumption figures, and then to continue efforts to reduce your emissions from your operational fleet. So that was a quick run through of all the some of the decarbonization actions that you can do to reduce your scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas footprint. So basically, how does this measurement fit in the entire organization sustainability strategy approach, strategy development, and ongoing program management? So basically, measurement is a key first step that helps organizations in their entire sustainability journey. So scope 1 and scope 2 are the easiest ones to undertake. So they should be the first activities that companies and organizations undertake. So once that is done, organizations should then set and look towards measuring their scope 3 footprint calculation. And at the same time, you should set targets. Once you have your scope 1 and 2 footprint, you should start to look at setting scope 1 and 2 science-based targets. And once you have done a scope 3 calculation, you should then look at setting your scope 3 science-based targets. And once you have all of those targets set, it will be good to have an overall carbon reduction strategy for your organization, and then which will then culminate in a long-term target, which is to set a net zero target, and ideally by 2050. So this is how organizational footprint plays within the entire organization's sustainability journey. So that sort of wraps up the presentation on my part. If there are any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. Is that you, Peter?
It is indeed. So yeah. Thank you. I was just going to ask you to wind up. You're bang on time. So Hassan, thank you very much for a very comprehensive session. Can I ask the cameras to be put on again for Pranoy and myself, please, Catherine? Are you able to do that? So while we're getting the cameras back on, there are a couple of questions that I think sort of overlie this. Let me start off with a question around this issue of how one ranks compliance and risk management and value creation around, you know, the whole issue of creating a carbon footprint and global strategies. I guess from an SME perspective here in Singapore, number one on our questionnaire list was compliance. So my first question is, how far are we away from, you know, greenhouse gas pathways, pathways to net zero being a legal requirement in this part of the world? And where does Carbon Trust see that going over the next few months, year, 2 years?
Yeah. Do you want to take this one, Pranay, or shall I start things off?
Yeah, maybe you can start first, and then I can add on to it.
Yeah. So I think that's a very good question, Peter. I think measuring carbon footprint is something that organizations should start to look at, and I think we've seen an increase in the number of organizations undertaking this activity. In terms of it becoming a regulatory measure, in this, I think in the UK, some companies are required to report their greenhouse gas emissions footprinting under the SACR framework. So that, and the UK is the leading light, it's a lighthouse in terms of sustainability and climate change measures. In Singapore, we haven't seen that yet, but I think as we move towards the more ambitious targets that Singapore has set, I think my personal view is that I think within the next 5 years, you will start to see hints and push from the authorities to start to look at this in a bit more detail. It may perhaps not be a regulatory measure, but it's something that I think there'll be we will see an increased focus on over time in Singapore, at least.
Pranoy, any comments? I mean, I hear, you know, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, you know, the audit authorities, you know, the accounting authorities globally are beginning to look at global, you know, carbon footprinting and GHG emissions as a regulatory measure for companies. Maybe they won't go down to the smallest of companies, but certainly, you know, higher corporates, public companies are going to have to commit. So actually, I think it's probably going to happen sooner than we think. Pranoy, I don't know if you've got any comments here.
Yeah, I mean, Peter, you are absolutely right. I mean, ultimately, the pressure will come to SMEs as well. So, I mean, if you look at the government, right, government has a lot of responsibilities. They have to make sure economically SMEs are thriving as well. They can't, you know, like impose a lot of carbon taxes or a lot of compliance requirement to them. So usually there are two types of approaches. One is like top-down approach, which will be basically from the government, like they will come up with measures, carbon taxes, you know, you have to submit your GHG footprinting report, And there will be something like a bottoms-up approach, which we are seeing, science-based target settings and all those things, which has to be, come from the organizations themselves, because there are stakeholders now. Like for example, if someone is making a purchase decision, now the consumers are making purchase decision not just because of the dollar value, also because of what is the carbon footprint of that product and what that company is doing in terms of, setting the climate targets as well. So I'll say, carbon footprinting is just the very first step. That doesn't necessarily mean an organization is reducing, but it is very, very important first step, because you'll be able to identify what are your hotspots and where you need to focus all your efforts and your strategies to reduce the carbon footprint. So yeah, going forward, I believe if by themselves, SMEs and all the corporates are not taking enough action, then yes, government will come in and from top down, they will bring, more stringent carbon taxes and other mandatory requirements as well.
So referring to a question by John Pexton in the UK, and also some of your comments about the fact that the Carbon Trust covers a wide range of different industrial sectors. I mean, intrinsically, when we're looking at, carbon and how emissions play out in those different sectors, clearly different sectors have different interests and very different requirements when it comes to reduce carbon as well. So if we look at the power sector or the industrial sector or the mobility sector or building sector or waste sector, they all have somewhat different nuances in terms of how this plays out. So a question directly to Carbon Trust around sectors is how much of your work, when you're looking at carbon footprints, is beginning to start focusing on sector-based approaches to this, as opposed to one generic approach to footprinting throughout the whole of industry?
So, if we look about, Hezam, you want to go first?
No, go for it, Brian.
All right. So, if we talk about the carbon footprinting, right? Definitely carbon footprint for each industry. Even not just sector, even each company is very bespoke. Every company has a different business model, different supply chain, and different kind of operations where they're procuring their energy from, their raw material from. So it will be very bespoke, and that's what we do. But if you talk about the sectors, like for example, power sector, the common things will be, most of their emissions will be coming from scope 1, because probably they have a gas-fired power plant, or they have a combined cycle power plant. So they will be burning some kind of fossil fuel. Hopefully in future we'll see alternative fuels as well, like for example hydrogen. But if you look at some other industries, like for example, if it is a manufacturing industry, if it's an F&B industry, they'll be using a lot of electricity, probably from the grid. So their scope 2 emissions will be higher. But
let me just come back and try and combine those two questions, and back to the compliance issue and back to John's question, John Pexton's question around methane emissions in the gas industry. The gas industry is making money hands over foot right now, so they're making plenty of money. Methane emissions are a real problem in the oil and gas industry. When are the regulators going to take this seriously and say, stop, no more methane emissions, and if there are, you're going to pay very high taxes, and it's going to punish you tremendously in your markets? Isn't it about time we got to that point?
I'll say at country level, a lot of countries are coming up with regulations specifically for methane, right? Because methane is one of the potent greenhouse gases, even more harmful greenhouse gas potential than the CO2. So in terms of, methane emissions, methane is one of the big concern in the agricultural industry as well.
Exactly.
And as well as in the oil and gas. But challenges arise, like when we are talking about fugitive emissions, right? How do we monitor and measure those? Like, for example, I think I saw in the question, there are like infrared cameras available, but that will just detect it. How to quantify in terms of numbers, how much? There are certain, I think the method is available for radioisotope carbon kind of footprinting and all those things. But Carbon Trust doesn't do that. We don't actually go out to the field and do the measurements. There are some other consultants who will do that work for us. But what we do is we take that data and we know how to convert that into the actual emission numbers in terms of. But Peter, your question was around the legislation, right? So yes.
Just adding to that, and another question by Leo Kirby around taking this a little bit further. How much work, for example, has Carbon Trust done with the regulatory authorities, looking at what incentives need to be put in place to actually create these decarbonisation technologies and accelerate them in this part of the world. I mean, to me, all of these things relate in terms of getting a move on. And you know, we've just had the latest IPCC report come out.
Yeah.
If it's not clear that we ought to be getting a move on now, it never will be clear. I mean, at the end of the day, unless we work this and work it now, we're in great trouble. And it's about time the world woke up to the fact that we need to come up with something realistic rather than talking about this in a theoretical context. Compliance and regulatory requirements are a must, surely.
So I mean, in that, I mean, we at Carbon Trust actually are working specifically on, you know, scaling up of the technologies that will help us, you know, accelerate our move to a decarbonized future. And specifically in Southeast Asia, we were doing this program called low carbon, LCP, low carbon energy program, where we were focusing on energy efficiency. And we were specifically helping F&B industries across Southeast Asia. First thing was, you know, they have to do their energy audit, like at least they find out where the energy is consuming. Once they find out where the energy is being consumed, then what are the energy efficiency kind of, you know, like technologies that they can implement. So we have helped that, I think, for more than 10 to 12 companies here in Southeast Asia and F&B companies. But I mean, your another question was, how is Carbon Trust working with the legislations as well, right? So specifically in this part of the world, we are not working that much with the legislation, but in Singapore, we are working with the government. We are trying to come up with some new ways of GHG accounting as well, which is called like consumption-based GHG accounting. So that is something we are still under delivery, I'll say. So we can't, you know, tell you much about that. But yes, there are things going on in the region as well with the government.
I think just to add,
you have something.
Just to add to that, I think the work that we do at the Carbon Trust, it spans across a lot of energy sectors. So for example, under the ASEAN Low Carbon and Energy Program, where Pranoy said our focus is on energy efficiency. So we do work with governments to design, for example, financial instruments to help scale up mobilization of larger amounts of private sector investment in energy efficiency, for example. So we are working with a couple of governments to develop guarantee mechanisms that is tailored to the needs of SMEs, especially because they are often the ones that have been excluded from conventional financing, especially for energy efficiency. And we are also looking at developing tools and mechanisms that can support the investment in credible and robust energy efficient technologies. So if we are taking the leaf out of the UK's example here, the UK Energy Technology List. It's basically a catalog of high efficiency products. So we are trying to replicate that approach in several countries in the region to scale up mobilization of finance to energy efficiency. And beyond energy efficiency, we are also working with a couple of governments on what kind of market mechanisms and incentive instruments need to be in place to drive broader energy systems transition beyond just energy efficiency. So this looks at how your power sector can transition, not just in terms of your generators, but what kind of mechanisms need to be in place to ensure that your existing transmission and distribution lines have the capacity to allow for increased amounts of variable renewable energy to be in the system. How can we account for that flexibility? How can we have this?
So one final question, and we are reaching the end of this, unfortunately, but just looking at those mechanisms and looking at, you know, where things are going. You know, the other message I think that is coming out of Europe and the UK now is around cross-border taxation and the fact that carbon taxation is going beyond just looking at industry and at a national level, but you're now beginning to start seeing UK MPs and the Europeans beginning to say, look, if a country is not doing enough in the carbon arena, we're going to tax their imports, right? So we're beginning to start seeing carbon become a fundamental part, not just of energy systems, but a fundamental part of the overall international trading system, right? Again, how far is that debate developed in this part of the world? And is there a need to accelerate that?
So Peter, what you're talking about is, just to give, what used to happen is, like most of the, kind of manufacturing will be located in Southeast Asian countries, developing countries, where most of the manufacturing of the emissions will take place. So now the thinking is changing by the government, as you mentioned. the one who is consuming the product should be accountable for where the emission, irrespective of where the product is manufactured. But I mean, that hasn't come into practice yet. But what I can say is we are working with some governments, and government is also trying to understand that place, what would be the impact, because they have to look at from a very high level point of view. If they bring in such kind of accounting methodology, what would be the impact? Because ultimately they have to run the country as well, and they have to look at the country's economy as well. But yeah, governments are exploring that, and we might see possibly very soon some of the countries adopting it. I think I read a news recently. I think Denmark was the very first country who has actually gone for the consumption-based GHG accounting. So we will soon see in this part of the world that kind of accounting practice coming in as well.
Very good. Well, look, I'm sorry we've run out of time. Thanks, guys, for a very interesting session. I think you've explained a lot of the mechanics of what needs to be done around carbon footprinting. We've raised some of the big macro issues now in terms of prioritizing this activity. It's clearly a challenging time, but a time of opportunity. And I think, one of the areas we haven't really covered, or you did to a certain extent in case studies, is that it's also a value-adding opportunity. For many companies, if you can actually get in early and start doing this stuff early, you're likely to gain value out of the company, which is, your pie company is a good example of a company that is actually going beyond what they really need to do because they can see a value-adding opportunity. I think that's probably an area that Asia is not terribly focused in either. I don't know if you want to make a very quick comment, but it's a personal view that that's another area where we should be reinforcing this activity. Is actually, this isn't an overhead, it's a way of making more money in the future if you're clever.
Exactly. I mean, it's an opportunity, as you mentioned, exactly, it's an opportunity. I mean, and the one the first mover advantage is always be there. Like, for example, if in the market there is a pie manufacturer whose product carbon footprint is lower than the competitor, then, I mean, as I said, the consumer actually will go for the product which is with the low carbon footprint, even though the price might be slightly higher. Consumer is ready to pay for that. I mean, I've seen that, yeah.
Yeah, good. All right, well, look, I'm sorry we're out of time. Katrin, you might just want to put one more slide up just to sort of blow Britcham's trumpet. Thank you again, Carbon Trust, for this session. I'm sure we will do a lot more of these sessions going forwards. But we have a lot of interesting events happening within Britcham over the coming months. Some of them are now in person. We've got a couple of major leader events with Dr. Tan, Ministry of Manpower. We've got a session with the EDB coming up. We've got a Myanmar business update, all in person, and various other issues around cybersecurity and many more energy utilities and sustainability events coming up. So without further ado, as we run out of time, I'm afraid, I thank the audience for sticking with us. This is the beginning of a number of conversations that I'm sure we'll have around the carbon footprint and where decarbonisation will be going in this part of the world and best practices from around the world. Thank you for joining, and we look forward to seeing you again, hopefully in the not too distant future. Thank you all. Goodbye.